Hey folks, it's Layman Pascal here, if you can believe that, and I certainly don't. Welcome back to the integral stage where we are starting to do something we probably should have done a long time ago, which is to organize conversations around new monasteries, intentional communities, and deliberately developmental living spaces. Who is doing these things? How did they get started? What have they learned from those who went before them? How are they related to other communities? And how do they think about the balance between practical necessities and developmental practice and the philosophical big picture and the needs of a post-modern culture facing a meta crisis? Joining me today to talk
Yeah,
about all this stuff from the Clear Sky community in Canada, one of its founders and senior teachers, Catherine Pawasart Sensei. Did I say that right? Pawasarat? Or
that's right.
Pawasarat? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, just how it's spelled. It's
Oh,
kind
it's
of
good to
long
see
and
you again.
intimidating. Good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
I kind of feel like we should alternate between kind of like nuts and bolts questions and then like big speculative questions.
Yeah, they're both important.
Yeah. Before Clear Sky, what was your involvement in and your impression of spiritual community experiments in general? How did you feel about them? What did you think they were maybe getting right, maybe getting wrong? What was your sense of them?
Gosh, that's a great question. Well, I didn't know of very many. Before we started Clear Sky in late 2004, I lived in Kyoto, Japan with my teacher, Qapel, also known as Doug Duncan, Acharya Doug Duncan. And he and I lived together with another student. The other student, Paul Jaffe, and I were both doing service for Qapel, which is an ancient tradition, doing service for your teacher. And then we had a Sangha, community of practitioners, some who lived nearby, some who lived further away. And we'd get together for classes and meditation and retreats. And we thought that this was community. And it really wasn't until we started Clear Sky that I don't think you learn about community until you're in one, really. I had visited other communities. I lived for 9 months in ayahuasca sacrament community in the Brazilian Amazon, which was an amazing experience that still informs my ideas about community today. They do incredible things with community, and part of that is much of it is thanks to their spiritual practice that they undertake together, that their whole community is centered around. And much of it is also informed by being Latin American. And Latin Americans have, I'd say, a better developed sense of community than white North Americans, anyway. And it can be challenging to parse these different elements out, but it can be very helpful to do so as well. And the other communities I knew centered around a teacher and were really dependent on that teacher. And for example, if the teacher died or if there was a scandal, the community would often fall apart. And that's also been very important to observe and to try to imagine what can we do so that the community has the strength, the mycelium network to hold together, come what may. Gurus die.
Gurus
And
die.
scandals happen. I think scandals are an important part of our spiritual practice, right? We need to be pushing the edge on all sorts of fronts. And that comes with risks, and it's good to be comfortable with risks, and it's good to be able to weather risks, as we were just talking about with climate change.
That's a really interesting and complex balance, like holding scandals, for example, right? And then
Hmm.
scandals are how real are they? How perceived are they? How much is it the fault of one person? How much is it does responsibility fall into the community itself? Um, how do people feel in terms of like if they were over idealizing it, then something collapses and they feel like they can't participate anymore.
Yeah.
So you want to have a like an anti-fragility, an ability to unfold it as a lesson and as a part of the life of the community, but at the same time, you also want to be able to make righteous judgments about circumstances.
Or
Um,
discernments. Yeah,
yeah,
discernments about
discernments.
circumstances. Yeah. Um, Absolutely. And I appreciate you going right there because I think part of my current theory, which is always evolving about scandals, is that we want to be able to have really mature conversations about them. We want to be able to talk about how we feel about the different subjects that are at the center of most scandals. We say money, sex, and power. And notice those are the first three chakras, if you start from the bottom up. And yeah, so I'm really trying to cultivate mature conversations so that we can get comfortable with discomfort, one, which brings a kind of resilience, and also help people probe where their comfort levels and boundaries are, because I think part of the issue is we may not know until something troubling happens, and then we find out what we're comfortable with and where we're not. And we can find that out ahead of time and be prepared and deepen our relationships with one another so that we can hold that space together.
I imagine that I'm curious how long the little cabal in Kyoto thought about this move before actually doing it, because I know a lot of people who always consider the possibility of setting up some kind of um, community, some kind of living arrangement for practice. But what does it take to actually pull the trigger? Like, what catalyzed you guys to actually go ahead on a real world embodied location rather than just consider it?
Yeah. Well, circumstances compelled us. We held regular retreats about twice a year in Japan. We were based in Kyoto. There's more than 2,000 Buddhist temples in the city of Kyoto, and it's, larger area. And we could not find a place to meditate. It was the darndest thing. And we knew temples were standing empty, and we still couldn't find places to meditate. And we'd find a place, and then the management would change, or something would happen. We'd lose it, have to start all over. And then we started looking at the books and realizing that we were handing over tens of thousands of dollars a year to rent a place. And of course, that quickly adds up to a down payment on a property. So my partner was Canadian, my late partner was Canadian, and many of his students were Canadian and many were American. I was born in the States, now have dual citizenship. So we looked on both sides of the border. Everyone was English speaking, and so that made the most sense to look in Canada and the US. And not all native speakers, but everyone could speak English. And we looked for land for a couple of, I think we went a month one summer and a month a second summer. And then we found our current place, Clear Sky Retreat Center, and made a down payment. And we would not have done it if we knew what we were getting into. It was a real blessing to not know, because I'm so glad we did it. We just turned 20, and it's been this incredible gift, and it has been so difficult. We had to really grow as individuals and as a community in ways that would have been too intimidating if someone had said beforehand, you will need to grow in this way, in this way, in this way. We would have been like, no, I don't think so. Kyoto's a great city. I think I'll stay. But it's been fantastic. It's been such a gift to be required to grow that way, to make our center and our community work. And I think everyone who is still standing is deeply, deeply appreciative and wouldn't do it any other way.
So you find the place, you make down payments, and I imagine since then there have been experiments, growth, transformations in how money operates in the community. So
Oh, yeah.
where have you guys sort of stabilized for now? What's the major source of funding for the community?
We are self-sustaining, and a combination of, let's see, we became residential. We didn't start out as residential, and the residents are a very important part of that. People basically pay rent, for food and accommodation for the privilege of living here, which is an amazing commitment because we all also worked to sustain the center as well and have day jobs. And then we generate revenue through retreats and through personal retreatants who come and use our amazing meditation cabins. We provide the food and other support for people to come and do retreats, and then donations. And it's a pretty healthy distribution between those things. And we have put a lot of work into that because I think, like a lot of centers in the very beginning, we were very fortunate to have a small number of extremely generous donors who generated a lot of merit through their generosity. And then that is usually, of course, finite. And at some point, they were no longer able to do that. And we were left dependent on them. And fortunately, we kind of saw it coming a year or two in advance, and we did the best we could. But there are a lot of mental models around money. It's, being the first chakra about survival. That's one of our key trigger points, I think, and one of the key places where a lot of shadow hides. So a lot of people were hoping another generous donor would just magically appear, or because we're spiritual beings and we're meditating a lot and we have an enlightened teacher, that the universe would take care of us. I think it's very standard. It sounds kind of funny to say it, but I think that's very normal in communities and in spiritual communities in particular. So then we all had to learn to become business people and to become financially mature. And nobody really wanted to do that. And it was a little embarrassing to realize that I would rather not do that. I would rather outsource it to somebody else. So fortunately, the pathology in that was very clear. And so we rallied, and now we have our community. Everybody knows how to work a budget. Everyone knows how to generate revenue. We have really great conversations about funding and sustainability of funding. And one of our Sangha members is a money coaching professional specializing in money and spirituality. So yeah, it's an area that we've done a lot of deep exploration around.
I'm curious about the decision-making protocols, right? You mentioned this problem of communities that are overly dependent in any number of ways on a single individual, and what happens if something goes wrong with, or if that person vanishes in some way. How do you sort of collectively make decisions when they pertain to everyone in the community? Is it voting? Is it councils? What's the procedure element of group decision making?
That's a great question. It's not super cut and dry. We have a board, we have an executive team. Both are very small. We're a relatively small community. We have 10 residents and about 100 community Sangha members that are not living on site, from living kind of nearby to living in Europe or Asia or Australia. And so the board votes, the executive team votes, and we have a basic guideline, which is that the most enlightened view always needs to predominate. And fortunately, we've had enough practice about that, around that the most enlightened view usually feels the best. So when someone puts that forth, generally speaking, everybody knows it's the best and is happy to go with it. So I don't know how accessible that would be to people who are not. A lot of our background is Buddhist practices, and we're very familiar with what that means in enlightenment, and we use it in the orthodox way of Satapana, Sakadagami, Anagami, Arhat, and the 10 levels of the Bodhisattva. And which is different from, I think people use it a lot nowadays to mean epiphany, have a spiritual epiphany. And that's also a beautiful thing, but not necessarily the best place to be making decisions from. Sometimes it is, depending on what the decisions are about.
Yeah, it might work well in artistic decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to say. Sometimes it can really determine the course of the rest of your life in a beautiful way, in a kind of high overarching one, but maybe not the best way to decide. Um, yeah, anyway, other things.
Well, speaking of artistic decisions, what role have aesthetics and creative projects played in the community? Like, I imagine that's over time, one of the interesting elements is how do we make this beautiful? How do people in the community express themselves? There's always options when you're building structures to tweak the way it looks to satisfy um, some sensibility that's deeply personal and somehow works with nature and somehow also embodies a higher resonance of some kind.
Such a great question, Layman. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to arts and creativity playing a bigger role here. It played a strong role in the very beginning. We had a number of courses that centered around the arts, and and then we entered a challenging time when we lost our super generous funders, when it was difficult just to make ends meet. And the artistic side, I wouldn't say it fell away, but it became more of a what individuals were able to and willing to contribute personally, right? How beautiful we could make the space because it was important to us. And now we have a sustainability mandate, or let me rephrase that, a generative mandate, which I think is more joyful than sustainability. And that was challenging until COVID. And when COVID happened, that all the work that we had put into that really came into its own. And we did well during COVID and have continued to do well and are so grateful to feel stable. And so now I've been thinking a lot more about how we can reintroduce creativity as such an essential part of life and human expression.
I love this hat, but it's way too hot for me. I'm sweating underneath this thing.
Oh yeah,
Which,
you got that thick sweater on. But how about you, Layman? What do you think is the role of creativity in community?
hmm, I think it varies, not exactly from person to person, but I think there's types of people for whom it's much more important, and it's difficult for
Hmm.
them to be fully emotionally engaged somewhere where they don't have the opportunity to be creative and to see that their creativity is incorporated into the structure of what's going on.
It's well described.
Yeah. I think there are also the practices of art help us when they're done in certain ways to develop our strength of will, right? To be intenders and manifestors who follow through on bringing something into the world, and also helps us develop skills for probing into subtle, affective, and imaginal dimensions of the world. So
Hmm.
I think those are important skills for any community, but for spiritual community in particular.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, nicely put.
Mm, One of the reasons we're even having this discussion is that our friend Mariah felt there was some common sensibility between Clear Sky and the Metamodern Spirituality Lab. And
Hmm.
so I'm curious, um, how does Clear Sky think about its relationship to other communities? Right? Has it been involved with other communities? Has it been mostly just focused on itself? Does it have, I don't know, critiques? How does it surf that? Given that there's a lot of these other ones out there, do you think about them? Do you not think about them?
Yeah. Good question. I think that from my experience, most spiritual communities are so challenged to do what that respective community is doing that I think we'd love to get to know one another and often feel like we don't have the resources to do that. And that's been my experience when I've reached out to other communities. It can also be a little bit of a tender space because you like to compare notes on what works, and that also includes what doesn't work. And so it's a little bit like, hi, we've just met. I'll show you my underwear if you show me yours. And not everybody wants to go there, which is totally understandable. And developing relationships and trust, of course, takes time, which is challenging in this modern age, especially, well, also if you're running a center. And yet I go to other centers. I love to go to other centers. I love to just look at how they do things and get ideas and see what they're doing really well. And when I sometimes find people who are open to talking about the challenges, I love to do that too. We can kind of open source a bit and trade ideas on what works or what has worked and what hasn't worked. And of course, some of that is transferable and some of it isn't because everybody's situation is different. And yeah, we're in a new phase of where we feel like we have the resources where we can connect more, which is part of the reason you and I are talking. And it's a really exciting time for us.
I come back to this question of the community dependent upon one figure versus a more distributed model.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a practicality to that, like you said. If anything happens with that person, then maybe you lose the community. But
Mm-hmm.
there's also, it seems like a sense of that many people are holding this impression that there is an evolution going on in the world where a new or deeper kind of intersubjectivity is becoming more important. And the
Mm-hmm.
possibility of uh, a different kind of shared wisdom body is on the tongue tip of a lot of minds at the moment.
Yeah.
And yet that's not simply an abandonment of one thing and replacing it with another. It's some kind of creative hybridization of individual teachers and uh, consciousness mutants of various kinds with the cultivation of some wise field of co-evolving participants. What are you seeing that hybridization starting to look like? Because I think you've been close up on a version of that terrain starting to unfold.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, my teacher Qapel, his teacher, who I also received lay ordination from, was a individual named Namgyal Rinpoche, and he was an extraordinary individual. He awakened in the Western Mysteries, which is Masonic tradition, Rosicrucian, Kabbalah, that nature. So he awakened in Europe, and then he met a Burmese insight master, Uttilawanta Sayadaw, who invited him to Yangon. And he went and became an Nanda Bodhi and furthered his realization in the Theravadan tradition. And then years later, he was traveling through India and met the 16th Karmapa, who spontaneously recognized him as Namgyal Rinpoche. And so he was an incredible being, and it was a blessing to be able to receive teachings from him. And I felt the same about my teacher, Qapel. It was, yeah, I feel so much gratitude for having been able to study with him for so long. And Namgyal Rinpoche said that group guru was the future. And he used to say he was the last of the red hot gurus. He died in 2003. So I think what you're saying is spot on, that that was an era when extraordinary individuals, kind of the peak of the pyramid of sorts, although Namgyal Rinpoche used to say he was at the bottom, was supporting everybody. But that was an important era. They were beacons in the darkness, and a lot of people were able to benefit from that light. And so those numbers of people are the next generation, and then more people benefit from those lights. And so the numbers of people who are awakening, I hope, are increasing. That's the idea. That's what our efforts are. And then that's great. Then you get teams of enlightened people working together, which is really useful for the planet and all species, all beings right now, is to have highly realized groups of highly realized beings who are sharing that wisdom and that love and that compassion to help us through these times. And it will take hundreds of years to really develop group guru. And so that's, I think, the challenge where we're at right now, which is we can bypass our authority issues in our enthusiasm to get towards group guru. And that would, we would just take our authority problems with us, of course, right? And they cause trouble later. So we still need to work through all those issues, which of course we all have. Everybody's got authority issues. So we work through that on the way, and as we integrate that, then that helps us be qualified to be in this fine company.
I find it it's a very enlivening possibility, group guru.
Mm-hmm.
And the areas I tend to inspect about it are around, different people have different depths of capacity in different collective areas. And so they're
Absolutely.
not all equal participants relative to particular tasks and contexts.
That's right.
And also, to some degree, you still have to have uh, a form in which things can be played out. So it's very interesting to set up spaces where you want to invite more of group guru, but maybe there's still somebody at the front of the room or in the center of the room. And how do we how do we arrange the architecture of people to make use of individuals and differences between individuals so that the group guru we get reflects these structures and variations and not just a homogeneity of human beings?
Yeah. Well, the Shambhala tradition had a very interesting and simple approach, which was that sometimes a group of people works best in a circle, and sometimes it works best in a square, and sometimes it works best in a triangle with a point. If you've got to get something done, a circle is a disaster. And uh, that then a triangle with a point with someone leading the way would probably be the most efficacious. But if you need stability, then a square is going to be the most supportive. And so knowing which you need when, I like these kind of simple models. I don't have to take a long time to describe them.
Yeah, they have a visceral quality that you feel like even the child in us gets immediately, okay, different options for different tasks. I get it.
Yeah, right on.
You mentioned that there's esoteric Eastern lineage and Western esoteric mysteries woven into your lineage.
That's right.
And I'm very intrigued all my life by the Western esoteric mysteries. And I'm curious what you think the hermetic and magical arts of the West have to contribute to all of this. Do they provide anything that isn't already in the Eastern contemplative models?
Yes, they definitely do. The Eastern contemplative models are so powerful, and it's a daunting task to become familiar with those. I don't know if anyone ever really becomes familiar with them because it's such an incredibly vast body of work across so many countries and cultures for millennia. And and that's all learned, right? Those are not models that are native to for example, white people raised in North America, as well as all sorts of other people, right? Um, Western mysteries, however, you say the magician, and that resonates right away. You can work with those archetypes, you can work with those energies. Of course, there's always more to learn, but those are energies that are available to us very readily and very powerfully in our psyches. And that's an incredible resource for us. It's a much more dynamic tradition of active meditations, of interacting with other people as part of the meditations, which is present in Buddhism as well, but not so much in the way that it's been imported into North America and Western Europe. I'm thinking of like the ritual dances, for example, are incredible moving meditations that are interactive, but I've really only seen those in places like Bhutan. And what do you feel the role is of the Western mysteries in contemporary spirituality, Layman?
It's something I think about a lot because it looks to me like there's a kind of new wisdom consensus emerging, and it's sort of emerging between developmental philosophy and cognitive science and Buddhism and some mystical Christianity. And it often leaves out um, things like the occult, which maybe it thinks is too disreputable, or maybe a lot of those people associate being interested in those topics with unserious, naive, unrealistic
Hmm.
people. But I think there are elements missing from the wisdom discussion if those esoteric mysteries aren't brought in. I think
Hmm.
there's a kind of uh, although you do get this in Tibet, there's a full spectrum colorfulness that you get from traditions that incorporate magic in various
Hmm.
ways.
Hmm.
I think you get an important emphasis on the development of individual agency, the will, and intentionality. You get the drama of ritual practice, which I think conveys patterns of insight about the world to deeper layers of ourselves. I
Hmm.
think that's really important,
Hmm.
as well as the just the general attitude of being welcoming and curious about what's at the edge of our game board outside the maps, right? Are there entities? Are there energies? Are there different
Hmm.
ways of interacting? Because I think a lot of the contemplative traditions fall into a reasonable trap of saying, don't focus on that. Those are distractions. Come back to your main consciousness task. But
Hmm.
there's a lot of reality that is only explored in practices like that. And we want as much of reality as possible to inform our wisdom practice.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's well described. Yeah, how can we not get lost in those incredible otherworldly experiences and yet take them into account is a yeah, a very sacred undertaking, I think, and and a very valuable one.
There's another element
There's
of it
so
for
much to
me.
the world that we can't see, right? Or so
Yeah.
much to life that we don't usually perceive. And for those of us who have been conditioned to be very rational, right? We don't have as ready access to that. And yet many traditions in the world, it's central to their existence and they've been greatly enriched by that. Yes. You were saying?
I still thought of a few things in addition to what I was going to say as well from your last remark there. I think there are that our contemporary science informs us about the extraordinary complexity and multidimensionality of reality in a way that science didn't do for us in the West 100 years ago. And we have a sense that there are these realms to explore one way or another, and that a
Hmm.
lot of what we see in the world is insufficient to account for what actually is in the world,
Hmm.
that we need explorers for that. I think
Can you give me an example? It sounds like you're thinking of something
hmm,
specific or some things.
well, one thing that comes up for me a lot is discoveries in sort of computation, right? There's a very interesting character named Stephen Wolfram, and they have a whole approach to computation, which is based on the idea that most of the possible patterns are not recognizable as patterns by us, right? So that if you started making a list of all the possible computer programs, almost all of them would not look to us like they have any order in them, but they are completely ordered.
Mm.
And so if you try to describe reality, try to make a physics, for example,
Hmm.
out of equations that we recognize as making sense, then we leave out a whole bunch of the processes by which the universe is organized.
Right.
And therefore, if we wanted to understand the universe more richly as individuals or a species, even in a technological way, then we have to think, okay, how do I relate to mystery? How do I relate to forms of order that will always surprise me and which will never
Hmm.
give me the comfort of looking like orderliness?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that reminds me of the Mayan calendar, which is such an incredible creation, and yet when Europeans met it, dismissed it as the work of the devil, and of course tragically did a too good job of destroying most of it. So yeah, I think there's really something to be said for humility in the face of the mystery and awe in the face of what we don't know and what we understand, and patience for the amount of time that takes for us to come to understand.
The Mayan calendar brings up for me another facet of the esoteric mysteries, which for me is a way of honoring and feeling resonant with ancient peoples,
Hmm.
right? That the longest period in human history was before we started living in cities and writing anything down, and that those people had some kind of Dharma instantiated in their lives. They were immensely capable, immensely creative. Their possibility for self transformation and wisdom must have been extraordinary under the right conditions.
Hmm.
And they did that in ways that looked to the civilized person like magic, like paganism, like strange rituals, but it actually is a very living, very embodied, very communal form of wisdom practice.
Hmm.
And when we touch into the mysteries, I think it's easier to feel back into and appreciate the ancient sources of wisdom
Oh
before the
yeah.
contemporary traditions got started.
Oh yeah. And to me, it seems the best way to do that is to try to spend time close to nature as much as possible, which of course is very challenging in modern life. But we were just talking this morning. We have these beautiful meditation cabins that now have electricity, but didn't for their first, I don't know, 12 years or so. And I did these month-long retreats in midwinter with a little wood stove. And I didn't grow up camping and I didn't grow up with a wood stove. And I developed a really keen appreciation of fire. And like you're describing, I felt this incredible connection to 10,000 years of human history, right? It's only until recently that we weren't entirely dependent on fire. I guess you could say we still are, but we're quite removed from that. And for me, that was a very profound experience to connect with that and to connect with human history that way and to connect with that element. And I felt so humbled. Like, wow, I've lived my entire life. I don't know, I was 40 or so at the time, and I didn't really have a connection to fire. And yeah, my life feels so much richer for that.
Hmm. Nature and elements brings up another question for me, which is, I think it's kind of globally pertinent because we're seeing a lot more migration for various reasons, and our capacity for travel has increased, and probably both of those will keep accelerating into the near future. And that means that most of us do not live in the landscapes of our ancestors or in ecologies that our heredity and culture evolved to serve us in. What, how would I put this? What has Clear Sky learned about how to become indigenous, about how to accelerate the rooting of people into place and into elemental circumstances?
Mhm. Gosh, that's a great question. I wouldn't claim to know anything about being indigenous. I would really need to defer to indigenous people about that. And that's a vast and complex subject. And I have been an immigrant my whole adult life, so for about 40 some year, 45 years. And that's really profoundly shaped my perspective. And when I first moved from the United States to Japan, I I planted plants in my little garden, and I think that's a very instinctual thing to do. I wasn't a tremendous gardener when I lived in the US, but I had this real urge to plant things, and I planted the plants I was familiar with, and they were in a new environment and they died. And I was grief-stricken. And I didn't know in those days Japan was still very Japanese. It wasn't very international. Not that many people spoke English. And I would go to the supermarket and I didn't know what to eat. I didn't know how to cook the food. And I felt a real connection with the millions of people around the world who find themselves in that situation. And that puzzlement and that grief and that difficulty being healthy in those kinds of circumstances. And now, clear sky, I have been, maybe that's why I've been an environmentalist my whole adult life too. And maybe it's that longing for connection with the land that shaped that. I've never thought of that before. But, and here I am in an environment that I don't really know that well, that I'm still getting used to in Canada, and trying to connect, trying to learn more, trying to be receptive to the wisdom that it's always sharing. And so I'd say that's the part that I try to share with people, is that we are a part of the ecology, whether we know it or not. And that's our mother's arms that are always available to hold us. And it's not just holding us, we're holding it back. And there's joy and there's beauty and there's health in that. There's love in that. And how can we do that ever more skillfully? That is a really beautiful exploration for me to explore that for myself, to share that with other people, to try to grow that movement so that of course we need to take care of the planet, but if we're not taking care of the planet, we're not taking care of ourselves. So yeah, growing care. Does it get better than that, Layman?
It's pretty good, growing care.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really there's a part of me that I can feel is untouched if I'm not making some kinds of connection with places that I'm staying in.
Hmm.
And I see so many people being mobilized for one reason or another into foreign places so that we're all becoming immigrants and we're all becoming superficial in a certain way. If you move to a city in another country, it can be a long time before you ever really encounter the nature of that place or what grows there. What are let the scent molecules of the local vegetation into your brain and eat all the things.
And even
Um,
longer to realize why that might matter.
yeah, yeah. And the interconnections. So I think disciplines like permaculture give people a really interesting way of thinking about how the elements of the landscape are actually dependent upon or synergizing with each other. So first you just have to get familiar with it, and then you have to see what the parts are. Then you have to try to see their interactions and their co-creations. Uh,
Relationships.
and that can be all very practical, but then there's also how do you make subtle and imaginal and deeply personal contact with these things? Do we
Uh-huh.
talk to the trees? Do we, make sure we put our feet into the dirt? All these sorts of things that are necessary for us to feel like we are of a place enough to taste the sweetness of home and to really to start to grow the instincts that serve that place as a part of ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. It's even here we live in nature. We have 310 acres and national forest or crown land on two sides and ranches on two sides. And I'm still undertaking to train myself to learn to not check the temperature on my phone, but to go outside and feel the temperature, right? Or to look at the thermometer, right? Or to I only just kind of recently learned that if you look at pine cones, they open when it's dry and they close when it's gonna rain. And there's what the weather's going to do. There must be signs of that all around us, and I still don't know what those signs are. And I think I have a pretty. Lots of people have a closer connection to nature than I do, but I think I have a pretty close connection with nature. So, um, yeah, that's a frontier I look forward to continuing to explore until I die, one way or another. And how about you? How is it there in which part of Ontario are you in?
I'm in Thunder Bay, so I'm right at
Oh, that's right.
the source point of the Great Lakes here.
Oh, that's right. And there is lots of thunder in Thunder Bay.
In the summers, there's a lot of thunder and lightning storms, which are
That must,
delightful.
oh my gosh, that must be incredible.
Yeah, my partner definitely likes to, if she hears it, she'll rush outside to get the sudden squall of rain and see the lightning. And you get a real sense of participation, and it's terrifying too when it happens,
Yeah.
not too far above you.
Yeah, that's right. And you feel it in your whole body.
Yeah.
Yeah, so exhilarating.
It's colder in the winter, and as a result, you don't spend as much time outside unless you intentionally do that, and
Yeah.
you sort of I suffer the lack of the information that's in the air, right? If to have all the windows shut overnight, I wake up a little bit uneasy, like I can't tell what's going on outside. I have to go out there and breathe it and touch it.
Uh-huh. Right, because you grew up on the coast.
Yeah.
Hmm.
There's the minerals here are very interesting. There's a lot of amethyst in the landscape. There are there, very many small creeks bringing all the water down toward the Great Lakes. So there's little rivers everywhere.
Hmm. Sounds
And the
stunning.
one of the interesting things that is afforded by the cold is that the rivers become like highways if you're on foot. So that's one of the things I like is, the cars move in little square patterns. But suddenly you have this opportunity to move through the city on these winding organic pathways, as long as you are willing to take the risk of going out on the river ice.
Is that right? You go through the city walking on the ice?
Yeah, okay. The rivers weave everywhere.
Oh, wow, that's
There's
cool.
seldom anyone down there. You get to see everything from a perspective that you never see from a house or a road.
Wow, that sounds cool. Nice. We have a lot of wildlife here. They call this area, this region is called the East Kootenai, named after the Tanaha tribe, which for some reason got transliterated to Kootenai. Someone had really poor listening skills or pronunciation skills, I guess. They call it the Serengeti of North America. There's an abundance of wildlife here, and it's a real joy to share the landscape with all these other creatures. And that's one of the things I like most about winter is that you see all of their tracks, and you might not see any animals, but you see they've been around a lot, and such respect for their ability to move so stealthily.
One of the things that seems to have destabilized a lot of experimental communities has been not getting the balance of individual space and collective space quite right. Right?
Hmm.
Because on the one hand, you need to people need to learn the strength to be much closer to each other than they might want to be, both for their own heart, but also to get things done in shared space. On the other hand, everybody needs some amount of individual sovereignty and space for their own pursuits and to have time away and to have personal relationships and things like that. How do you think about trying to get those balances correct? What have you seen? And I'm sure it's different at different times when communities are facing different challenges.
Yeah, great question. Thanks for bringing that up. That's definitely been one of the biggest challenges that we've had at the center, which is basically that we're all raised with this illusion of autonomy, and we have whatever your own fill in the blank, your own room, your own house, your own yard, your own car, your own and your own space, let's say. And in community, that just by definition starts to become redefined. And the strength of community is sharing resources. So that's a real asset, but that also means giving up some sense of ownership and some which can entail giving up some sense of sovereignty. And it triggers real crises. And we've started to map the stages that people go through. It's kind of, we call it a Sangha line of development. The stages that we go through as we go from living our own life, quote unquote, which is really an illusion. It's just that we don't meet the people who are growing our food. We don't meet the people who are um, giving us our salary or even putting it in the ATM machine, right? But there are people at the end of those processes. We just sort of think we're doing it we're led to believe that we're doing it by ourselves. And yeah, you get into community and that process of those boundaries becoming redefined triggers crises. And it takes time and it's challenging, and people may or may not want to lean into that. And this is one of the things that I find so compelling about climate change is I think it takes communities of people to address climate change and to offer a more promising future for future generations. And I feel a real commitment to that. I feel not just a commitment, I'm excited to leave really great things for future generations to benefit from and to build on. I think that is such a life worth living, and I can't do any of that by myself. And it doesn't take that many people to be able to really start creating positive change. And then we have to learn how to be different in our definitions of space and personal space and privacy and what's mine and what's ours and what's yours and those boundaries. And I would say when we started this community, I found myself totally unprepared for any of that. I feel like there's a skill set that goes along with that process, and I didn't have any of those skills. And I think I was a pretty normal person, I don't think I was completely socially maladapted or anything like that. So that was really intriguing to me. And what a short period, because humans have lived together for, of course, most of human history in various levels of community. And we lost a lot of those skills really fast. And I don't seem to be alone. It seems to be something that we all struggle with when we transition to living in community. And then, well, let me give you the good news. The good news is once we go through that process, it's way more fun. It's way more interesting. Not really sure, why I wanted to be alone in my room with the door closed. I'm not really sure what's so especially attractive about that, right? I can still go for a walk by myself in the woods, or I can have tea with my friends and colleagues, and it's all joyful. So in a sense, it's like expanding our definitions of joy, expanding our capacity for, I can get joy in a lot more different ways than I used to be able to. So, yeah, joy bandwidth increasing is definitely a benefit of community done right, I would say.
As you were saying that, a lot of the points, leaving something for future generations and the kind of village component of community and joy expanding, for a lot of people, that's related to family and having children,
Hmm.
which is anciently an important part of human community, but not always emphasized within spiritual practice communities that need a little bit more um, monastic security. Is there a How does Clear Sky relate to children? Is there a place for children there going forward, or is there something about it that means it's a little bit more specialized than that? It's not a breeding community.
Breeding community. Oh, never heard that term before. Yeah, I guess you'd have to say that we're not currently a breeding community. There are no children residing here, and I see that in our future. We we had a mandate from my teacher Qapel to prioritize our spiritual unfoldment. And so those of us who chose that path chose to give up a number of things, and one of them was the family life. And I think for me, another motivator for that was the world population, which I felt I love children and I love being around children, and I didn't feel a super strong. I wanted to be a mother, but it was, I think, number 4 or 5 on the list of things I wanted to do in this life. It was number 5, and I thought I don't want my children to feel like they're number 5. And I thought if I want to have children, they need to be number 1 or 2 I think that changes throughout their lifetime and depending on their age and so on. But I thought top 3 for sure. And so I'm okay with that. I feel good about, and this is just for me, but I feel good about, okay, so I'm not having children just because I'm kind of supposed to, and thereby increasing the population problem. I think conscious parenthood is just an incredible, beautiful path and a very important one. And I think that in the future that will be part of the Clear Sky community as well. And I don't think it was possible in these first 20 years because it was so difficult for us to get established. And how do you feel about that, Layman? I know you have children.
Yeah, they're my partners from her previous relationship, but I've also got several godchildren in various places.
Hmm.
I never felt strongly motivated to children, and in some ways, my whole life has been uh, decreasing the privileging of genetics in some ways, right? Sort of,
Mm.
right, thinking about the future. I like to be around children as a way of practicing care and also experimenting with developmental principles. As you
Hmm.
get to see them changing and
Oh,
growing, it's
yeah,
fantastic. And
it is.
it's enlivening. They refresh you in certain ways, and
Yes.
they force the development of certain strengths and responsibilities in you as well. So that's all very beautiful, but it never felt important to me to pass on my bloodline. That was,
Hmm. Hmm.
and that's a feeling that's only strengthened for me over time.
Hmm.
And yet, I think a lot of the best communities and wisest people are often the most reluctant to reproduce, right? And if we don't have we don't have some mechanism to encourage the reproduction, the physical reproduction of wiser people and wiser families and wiser communities, then they play a decreasing role in the human future. And they
Hmm.
get sort of outcompeted by people that aren't taking as much care.
Interesting
So
question. I don't know that it's genetic. I guess I basically feel that wisdom is not genetic, although seem to be exceptions to that too. And I know you didn't mean that wisdom was genetic, but and I have to say, I think that's a big deal to not want your genes to be passed on. I think that's a really, really strong force in, I think it's biological. I was really surprised when I was about 36, 37, 38, and I felt like my body was really kind of demanding to have children. And even though in my mind I didn't feel that I wanted to, and it was kind of challenging to be, I don't know, the mind and body sharing space during that time because they were at odds, and I was very struck with how strong that urge was.
mhm. Yeah, it's I think at the heart of some aspects of spirituality has always been um not disembodiment, but having a more complex relationship to certain aspects of embodiment. So that right, whether it's ascetic practices or it's a
Mm,
complication of our relationship to having children or things like that.
yeah.
Having those two elements in us creatively struggling with each other produces a richness that I really love. And I
Mhm.
see something in the world that's very strange too, which is, for billions of years, life and sexuality and reproduction have driven the forms of nature and the forms of psychology and the forms of culture. And now it's been a generation or two since we got these tools to like inhibit reproduction or to reproduce in new ways. We're beginning to be able to generate human bodies in other circumstances and to modify them at the structural layer. So there's something going on in the world and in human civilization, maybe as an expression of nature reflecting on itself, that's changing the relationship to heredity. And
Mhm.
I think it will be many centuries or thousands of years before we see what the consequences of that are.
Mhm.
But there is a shift going on that modern technology has allowed.
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting topic for sure. And how interesting that they talk a lot about the late 1960s and early 70s, of course, as this extraordinary time. And you don't often hear that much. You hear about free love, but the basis of free love was the birth control pill, right? It was the first time that women could have a feeling of control over whether or not they got pregnant. And and so soon after that comes in vitro fertilization and test tube babies, you know, not separated by very much time to increase reproductivity. It's very curious how these things, one happened right on the heels of the other.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I
yeah,
think you're
it's
right. I
a
think it will take a long time for us to sort through what's happened, what's happening, what's going to happen.
yeah. I mean, it has immediate effects on the culture, but at the same time, a generation or two is not enough time for beings to process such a potentially radical shift in how life has been operating on this planet.
Yeah, so true.
At the same
So true.
time, we do have to then think more intentionally about how we're reproducing, right? Rather than just going forward the way the other species have gone forward. We have to be more, a little bit more responsible, studious, thoughtful about it somehow. And I think there is an element of not that wisdom is passed on genetically, but that the kinds of people who are devoted to cultures of depth and practice and transformation, um, if we don't, if their sensibility and their understandings and their learnings aren't passed on to the next generations and at deep levels, and if their understandings of care aren't instantiated in ways that a next generation can come up and expect that to be the standard of care going forward, then we lose something. And it's very tricky to think about how development oriented people, who are often in some ways the least likely to reproduce because they have these other investments and they have special standards they would want in order to reproduce, how do they, yeah, how do they breed forward as a culture? It's a really interesting and open question that I don't think has been
Yeah,
very deeply addressed yet.
I think you're right. A student and I were speaking about this recently. We were talking about the most of our Buddhist resources are Vajrayana Buddhism, Himalayan Buddhism, and so we were talking about the Tibetan approach and how we follow that approach as we've learned it. And in Asia, where these cultures, the Buddhist philosophy and practices are so well established that many children are immersed in it to the extent where it's become such a part of the culture that it's not even really identified as Buddhism anymore. And then, of course, with the reincarnation system and monasteries and convents in general, a very young child can receive teachings and trainings from the age of 4 or 5 and really have a lifetime of spiritual practice, not necessarily with their parents, with parental figures, perhaps maybe just one gender. And then there's people like us who meet the teaching. I started my practice, this type of practice, when I was 30. And so, I was raised a capitalist consumer, and a lot of the practice has been about undoing that so that I can replace it with with virtues, basically. And so it's really an entirely different experience with some similarities between those. And yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, what happens when you get committed spiritual practitioners, for example, or committed to a spiritual vision, who can raise children in that environment? And then what are those children like? And I know there have been examples of that throughout history, but I'm not real familiar with those examples. It's a very interesting question. And yeah, a very promising one, I think.
You mentioned that your teacher wanted the community to prioritize spiritual unfolding. And I guess the question is, how's that been going? What are for you, what are the internal signs that the path you're on is a good one, that it's actually been doing something for you?
Oh gosh, yeah. I Joy is a big one. The How pervasive is joy? How pervasive is equanimity? Equanimity can sound kind of boring, like a flat line, but it's more like not getting rocked by the ups and downs and vicissitudes of life, which is very valuable in these times. I see a lot of tumult in the average person's daily experience. And it's hard to be at peace amidst that. So peace would be another one. Yeah, love, all the good things, Layman. I'm constantly kind of checking, is this good? Does this feel good? Does this feel peaceful? Does this feel loving? And as you know, meditation is moment to moment, and it's not a solo sport. right? It's how's everybody else doing? And everybody else includes, in our tradition, includes all beings, and that's also really fun. We have a chronically cranky kitty and all this wildlife. And then, of course, there's microorganisms in the soil. How's everybody doing, right? Because thriving together, that was a big impetus here. We've done a lot of ecological restoration. And part of the thinking behind that was if the environment is thriving, then it will support the humans to thrive also. And can humans thrive in a environment that is degraded? The kind of common sense conclusion would be no. And then you get these virtuous cycles of, we're supporting the environment's supporting us. And there's a lot of love there, and a lot of like easy access to love, a lot of kind of immersion in love, and in that kind of approach to life and practice. And can I pose the same question to you, Layman? How do you take stock of how your path is going? What are your metrics?
I tend to use, words like beingness, something like that. So, has my sense of my basic existential quality, when I check on it, is it more stable, more solid, more coherent? It seems to be. Seems like the last few years in particular, that a quality of that an uncertainty or an empty space that was in me that drove a lot of my practices and continued to be there regardless of my state experiences of various kinds, that space is now full of something that is very, it gives me a great deal of cheer, and I feel I can rely on it. Who knows what happens after death, but when I check on this thing, it feels like it's going to just keep going.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
And that makes me delighted.
Uh-huh. Nice. Well, we've talked about a little bit about money. We've talked a little bit about power with the authority figures, our universal authority issues. So the only one we haven't talked about yet, well, we have talked about sex, right? We've talked about children anyway. Children tend to happen after sex. But that
But
is
we haven't
we
talked about sexual dynamics in community.
that's right. And I think that's a important part of it in particular because I don't know if it's just recently or if it's always been this way, but it seems to be the cause of a lot of controversy and doubts around community and around teachers and ethics and so on. So how are we on time, Layman? And
Well,
how
good. Let's
old are
say
you
we have
feeling?
another. Let's do another quarter of an hour. If we go up to the half hour mark, that would be probably pretty good. And beyond that, it becomes a little bit too much for a listener to
Of
listen to.
course. Yeah, of course. I respect anyone
It's a
who's hung in this long.
it's a really rich topic because it's such an
Hmm.
important part of the emotionality and the subconscious psychology of people. And it seems to me where the leading edge questions are around uh, what counts as consent in different ways, and how consenting can you be with power structures or
Hmm.
people who have a lot going on internally or who are perceived to have some kind of a status in the community.
Hmm.
And how do we make a richer and more open and more humane conversation around these things? One of the things that I notice a lot is there isn't really a frank discussion about how people relate to what we might call sexual needs, right? And that's a question that is open to critique because people might feel something very strongly, and actually that's an opportunity for them to grow past those inner prompts. On the other hand, they might um, as a organism and as a person have very sensitive needs in some areas, and if they can't express that and explore that in community space, it doesn't go away. They start to express and explore it in community adjacent spaces of various kinds, and that's when it becomes problematic.
Right,
But
right. Or shadow spaces. Hmm.
it's hard for a lot of people who are developmentally oriented to even speak in terms of needs. Given that we have to put needs in brackets, it's a strange concept, but we want to assert ourselves as already being beyond these things,
Oh, uh-huh.
rather than making ourselves vulnerable to different ways of exploring them with each other.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. I think what comes up a lot for me, I think we're in this really interesting time where well, for one, going back to our previous conversation about the pill, where women have more input into when and whether or not we bear children, and that's a certain kind of power and influence that women didn't have before, and then the economic disparity is diminishing, at least in some populations in some parts of the world. And I think I think that we're part of what we're witnessing is that development meeting these traditions where that are largely male dominated, where it's mostly men in the authority positions. And most of those traditions coming from Asia are very vertically have very strong vertical hierarchies. And then in North America, we have at least this feeling of being a democracy, which is, of course, more horizontal. So I feel like all of these things are coming together at the same time without a roadmap. And this is the space that we're navigating. I do think that we tend to underestimate the power of, or maybe overestimate the power of a person in an authority position. Of course, there's some power there, but I look back on when I was a young woman with, allegedly none of that kind of power, and I feel like I had a lot of power from being a young woman. I just didn't know how to use it skillfully. Well, depends how you define skill. I kind of knew how to use some of it, right? So I appreciate what you're saying, Layman, because I think there's a lot of room for more frankness in these conversations, and taking more risk of saying things that might potentially upset people. And that's okay, right? That's how we develop resilience, is to get upset and figure out what made us upset, and to come back into the conversation and bring those responses back and explore them together. I think this is super important. And as a female teacher of Tantra, for me, this is really exciting ground where sexuality is part of this tradition. That's a very, very broad spectrum. When I talk about sexuality, that goes everything from, well, it's everything from celibacy to polyamory or group sex. Sexuality is vast, and I think we kind of try to put sex in a box and say it should be a certain way and just between certain people under certain circumstances. And like you were saying, I think that can make it very problematic, because then that powerful energy sort of instinctively tries to break through those constraints. So, and I think if it's a bit more welcoming to all the different manifestations of human sexuality and human imagination about sexuality, then the energies are not so potentially destructive.
Yeah, I think there's one side of this is general human um, cleaning up and becoming more intelligent and also more open and more daring. And then there's
Uh-huh.
another side, which is what happens in deliberately developmental spaces where people have practices that can supplement their experience of these things, right? So if we want sexual energy, whatever energy really means, to be part of our practice, then we have to be able to tease it apart from the part of our brain that wants to take it as just an action prompt, right? We have to be able to perceive possibilities of stimulation and receive them with some kind of open solidity in our being. So that we can explore it, experiment with it, do different kinds of transformations to it. And all of that is facilitated by certain kinds of practice where you learn to feel it as energy,
Hmm.
and learn to be better at locating it, but also better at not succumbing to it in the form that immediately presents itself so that you have a chance to work with it somehow.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well said. And energy and I think sexuality, the attractiveness of one of the I think most attractive aspects of sexuality is the vitality that's present. Often when we talk about something being sexy or sexually attractive, it's got a sense of vitality to it. And of course, every organism needs vitality. And like you're saying, there's many different ways to approach cultivating vitality. And healthy expression of human sexuality is just one of those, and an important one of those. It's an important one we may choose to not include in our life, or it's an important one we choose to include, or sometimes yes, sometimes no. And I think you mentioned sovereignty earlier, self-sovereignty. Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for us to explore what that really means. What does self-sovereignty mean for me? And that includes a lot of responsibility about my own choices.
And it's a much more complex consideration in spiritual communities because the interblended dimension of beings is more vividly experienced in those communities. So, what does my sovereignty look like, and how do I support it in myself and in others when there are a number of dimensions where I am not the entity and neither is the other person? Where there's something that we have in common or something that blurs between us or something that we co-invoke. So all of these different complexities are fascinating. And I think developmental community spaces are really the only place where people could explore this intelligently. So if they feel up to it, I think they're doing everyone a service by exploring this way.
Yeah, yeah, that's a fascinating topic. I mean, um, that we'll have to leave for another time. Stay tuned, friends.
Well, that seems like a very natural spot to end this.
It does.
This has been absolutely delightful. I look forward to our next conversation, our next excuse to do
Me,
something together.
me too, Layman. Thanks so much. Really good to see you.
And
And thanks to everybody for listening.
thanks for giving them a sense of what Clear Sky is and what it's been working on and how it came to be in this world.
Absolutely. And is it all right if I say the URLs?
Sure, please.
Okay, yeah. You can learn more about our center, Clear Sky, at clearskycenter.org, and about our virtual community at planetdharma.com. Thanks, Layman. So good to see you.
You too. Bye.